sports gambling has exploded in the last few years. Is there any way there's like some platform where you can like bet on study outcomes? Like, can I invest a few $1,000s and see if I can predict how these studies will go? Because I think I might be able to make a few bucks.
Yeah, it's really challenging and it's fun to do this because one of the cool things I use ChatGPT as a kind of a pre-peer review process. So I'll write a paper, I'll write up a bunch of notes and be like, what if I word it this way and I draft it this way and whatever. And then I'll give it to ChatGPT and say, hey, Chat, review this like a peer reviewer and tell me what things I should correct from a scientific method perspective. Right. And it'll come back and say, the way you worded this is biased. The way you worded this looks like you're trying to lead the reader. Like, and so I have to go in and you have to be cognizant of those things because you don't want to publish something as a good scientist. You don't want to publish something that is obviously an intent to try and get a point across or get your own belief into it, right? It's this, the data is the data, right? You can interpret it a certain way, but you have to interpret it in a certain way that it makes sense with what's being presented, not just because you feel a certain way about it. So that's a challenge, but it's also kind of cool to see that even as much as I can objectify the findings that we're getting, it's still not making keto look bad, right? And if you look at the big picture, you know, this paper, let's talk about this paper we just put out. So I had a pleasure of working with some really awesome people, Peter Cummings, Philip Prinz, and Professor Noakes. And we basically proposed that the way, and again, you'll appreciate this because this used to be your bread and butter, the way that we interpret metabolic performance based on oxygen output is heavily biased toward carb-fueled athletes, right? So we look at oxygen intake, you know, the more effort and duration you put into, the higher your VO2. You figure out what your VO2 max is, and everything you do from there is based on a percentage of your VO2 max. So we can say, oh, at a traditional athlete, for example, somewhere between 65 and 70% of their VO2 max is where their glycolytic crossover point happens, right? Somewhere around 65, 70%, carbs become more predominant in their energy provision than fats do, right? So that's okay, fantastic. That's great. We know that. Most people that are highly efficient carb-fueled athletes, that might be closer to that 70. If you're less efficient, that might be closer to 65, right? The lower percentage that crossover happens, the less efficient you are. But when we look at fat-adapted athletes, their crossover point's at 85%. Why does nobody ever talk about that? They're using more oxygen because they're fat adapted, and that's what the paper that we wrote is about. So when we measure, there's a term called movement economy, and it's basically an equation that only looks at oxygen to work performed. So it's if you're doing steady state work at 65% VO2 max, how much oxygen, you know, how many liters of oxygen per hour do you burn, right? If it's 4 liters an hour, then that's, you know, based on where you were before. If it was 4 liters an hour today and it was, you know, 5 liters an hour last week, you've improved your economy because you're burning less oxygen for the same amount of work in the same amount of time. If it's, you know, if it's 6 and you were 5 last week, you're getting worse, right? What happens though is fat adapted athletes, when you're fat adapted, you're burning more fat, which means by default, you're metabolically going to utilize more oxygen because fat is an aerobic fuel source only. It only burns with oxygen. So at baseline, I'm burning more oxygen. So here's a great example. If I'm carb adapted and I start an intervention and my VO2 at 65% is 4 liters an hour, and then I go fat adapted, and then 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks later, I do the test again, and it shows that I'm at 6 liters an hour. By the equation, I am less efficient because
But your
I'm burning
VO2
more
score is higher.
oxygen, but I'm burning more oxygen. The oxygen cost for the work that I'm doing is lower, or sorry, is higher, right? Because the idea behind movement economy is oxygen is the source of the energy. So if I have to burn more oxygen, I must be working harder, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's where we get into the problem. So there are dozens of studies out there. There's actually there's actually two base studies that were done several years ago, 2017 maybe, by Louise Burke in Australia, who basically came to the conclusion. She did a study with race walkers and said their movement economy, the amount of oxygen they produced for the same level of work was more, so they are less efficient. Keto's bad for performance, right? Then they did another one where they duplicated the work, came out with the same thing, and said, we verified this in another set of people, blah, blah, blah. We did whatever. The movement economy got worse. They used more oxygen for the same amount of work. Keto is bad for performance. And those two studies have basically become the calling card. Every single study that I see where the conclusion is keto is bad for performance references those two studies.
That is completely backwards in my understanding.
Correct. Which is why we came out with this paper. So this paper proposes a way to include another factor in the equation. Right now, the equation is basically how much work were you doing at a given time? How much oxygen did you use? And we're saying, what if we also include a consideration for what substrate is being primarily accessed? Because the energy output will be different if I'm burning mostly carbs or mostly fat. So now we figure out how do we add RER, respiratory exchange ratio, into the equation of movement economy. Because right now, anybody that does indirect calorimetry, we get RER, we can tell that. But for some reason, nobody has said, well, just because VO2 is increased, let's look at RER. If VO2 is increased and RER is low, we know they're mostly burning fat. And it says it. This is the thing and this is a little bit of history. The reason this paper happened was because I was actually working on a rebuttal paper to the ISSN's, the International Sports Nutrition Society, International Society of Sports Nutrition. They have a position stand on ketogenic diets and sports performance. That position stand, they are the largest international sports nutrition organization in the world. That position stand basically says ketogenic diets are no different or detrimental to sports performance. And the detrimental piece comes directly from the Louise Burke study in race walkers. That's their reference for that statement. It's all about movement economy. So I was working on a rebuttal to this statement. It came out in 2024, right, last year. As I was working on it, I realized all of these detrimental statements I keep seeing, keto's bad for performance, are all leading back to this Louise Burke study. And then I started digging into, well, what is movement economy? How does it affect? What are we doing? And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. In the same study where they talk about oxygen is increased, in the very next paragraph, it says, but all of the athletes were burning more fat than the carb athletes. It's like the data is there. How are we not connecting the fact that if you're burning more fat, obviously your oxygen is going to be higher, right? I'm looking at this kind of scratching my head going, I got to be missing something.